So we're talking about, we've been talking a lot about the gap in funding for the United Nations SDGs. Derek, my colleague, tells me it's 4.2 trillion US dollars. And global wealth is 430 trillion. So all we need to do is unlock less than 1% of global wealth. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Especially from an NGO perspective, from the communities upwards, it's a humongous task to even think about it. Localization is increasingly popular nowadays amongst donors and also international agencies. It is an approach that focuses on a not-for-profit infrastructure to actually work and to absorb funding and deliver impact. But are organizations ready for this? Are we really ready to absorb this level of money? Donors and funders focus more on funding programs and not overheads. How can they be prepared to help the not-for-profit sector to scale up? Whether it's overseas donors, whether it's donors from within the country. We have another problem with the pandemic. The pandemic has been a fragility multiplier, and we all know that it has stalled or reversed the progress towards several of the SDGs. It's now imperative for all of us together here to address the setbacks that we have faced over the last 3 years. Do we need a strategy refresh? Do we need to relook at how we were doing things? The SDGs emphasize leave no one behind. How do we ensure that we reach the last person? How do we ensure that we reach the last child? About 119 to 124 million people were pushed back into extreme poverty in 2020. An additional 101 million children have fallen below the minimum reading proficiency level. Child labor rose to 160 million in 2020, which is the first increase in the last 2 decades. And we could all go on and on. From a core periphery point of view, there's a strong push towards the decolonization of philanthropy and of knowledge, particularly in the context of the global north and the south. This builds ownership locally and is said to be more sustainable and efficient and effective. Within India, too, hyper-localization is being discussed as a way to bring forth the importance of local and contextual strategies, of actors, local languages, cultures, and local agenda. After all, it matters who sets the agenda. There is a push towards alliances between stakeholder groups, and there's a push towards system change as a way to catalyze movement to achieve the 2030 agenda. So the SDGs today invoke all societal actors across all walks of life. Government, corporates, educational institutions all have an important and critical role to play. Our special panel here today will explore issues around localization and the role of local NGOs in the institutional ecosystem, especially geared towards delivering on the SDGs. As our panelists describe their experiences, I would request us all to think about 3 questions that I would ask. I'm going to reveal them one by one. So the first question that I'm going to ask all the 3 panelists today is, what are the opportunity costs of ignoring NGOs in the institutional ecosystem that is dedicated to delivering on the SDGs? In other words, I just want to, sorry, I'm using my notes here so I don't. In other words, what do we lose if NGOs are not involved? Why do we need NGOs at all? So could we start with you, Nagma?
Thank you very much, and I love your first question. I love the context of this discussion. It's a pleasure to be able to share this conversation with some of the most endearing people that I know. So thank you for having me here. We need NGOs in an environment where people don't stand up for their own rights or really believe that they're not entitled to basic amenities and rights by the governments that they choose to be in power. That's why we need NGOs. And in a beautiful, fair world, we wouldn't need them. But like everything good. Our lives are what they are. India does have a huge amount of population that is below poverty line. During the 2 years of pandemic, 230 million people fell below poverty line, and we had a billionaire being created every week. So we're talking about an unchecked transfer of wealth every time there is a stress in the system. And that is where NGOs become important, because they become the bridges for the last mile for those people who, for some reason, cannot access their rights themselves. What is very important, however, is to not view them as service delivery folks who are there to distribute the last mile rights, which somewhere during the pandemic I started becoming a little worried about. That we treat them as the people who distribute ration in far to reach areas, and will that be the status quo? I'm glad we're having these conversations, because that reset is very, very important. NGOs are able to even help government, as well as folks like us who would like to be there and facilitate any kind of access for the most poor. NGOs become those facilitators. That's why they're important. The discourse around localization, I would just be a little cautious, because the fact is that where finance is concentrated, it's easy to talk about localization, right? If I'm in Bombay, then Maharashtra will get the benefit. But what about the Northeast? What about Sikkim? What about the far to reach areas? So yes, local wealth for local problems is important, but we also need to look at India as our country instead of zones and districts in itself, because that will again create a different kind of disparity of wealth. I think I will just rest my answer here.
Thank you so much. Gayatri, it would be wonderful to hear from you about the opportunity costs of not including NGOs.
Sure. So I'm going to again say thank you for having me here and having us share our views. We had a little discourse before this and realized that there's a reason that we were asked to speak after lunch. It's to keep all of you awake. So hopefully this conversation will do that. But to answer your question, Nivedita, I can't imagine a world without NGOs. And I'm not saying this because I used to work in an NGO and I'm biased, but I'm seeing it much more right now from the side of a donor. We work very closely with the central government, with state governments, and we've realized that while government has schemes, has money put in various opportunities for the citizens of this country to access, it's still not reaching the ones who deserve it the most. And if NGOs are not on the ground understanding what the needs of people are, helping them translate what these schemes mean for them, even the projects that we do, you'd think that money can solve problems. It can only to a very small extent. But if we didn't have local NGOs on the ground who are actually helping us create that impact, then all the money in the world can do nothing. So even unlocking 1%, it's the first step in solving the problem. But without having local NGOs translating that into actual action on the ground, it won't work. So I can't put a number to the opportunity cost, but there's absolutely no way we could have made any impact or even start working closer to delivering on our SDGs without NGOs on the ground. And I think that's where localization helps. It's not about the funding being local, but the local NGOs are the ones who truly understand the pulse of the village they're working in, of the little town they're working in, or even of the very hamlet that they're trying to serve.
Thank you so much. Tina, thank you so much for being here. I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts were on this point of why we do need NGOs, or many people say we don't need them. There's no requirement. You can deliver services. There are ways in which governments can work too. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Am I audible? Yeah. Thanks for having me here. Thank you, AVPN, for having invited me here. And I think both Nagma and Gayatri have beautifully summed up why we need NGOs, what's the role that they play, the importance of them having a pulse of what's going on within communities, and actually being that important bridge of taking across messages from ground up towards those who have resources or those that are policymakers. And I very much agree with all of these thoughts. I think our world, especially within our country, there is so much of inequality and disparity that the role that the NGO plays is very crucial in making a bridge across different groups and different communities. If I were to speak a little about the opportunity lost, if we sort of ignore the very crucial gaps that we see in certain types of fundings. I will draw on a little on my experience of having worked with different grant partners and nonprofits. So when we actually began with funding certain programs, we'd initially start with funding a program either on training or skilling. And as we kept in touch with the program, we unearthed different challenges, and we tried to listen in to the grant partner. And then we realized that there were certain roadblocks to a program becoming better or more improved or delivering more impact. So over a period of time, I mean, it does take time for even the philanthropist or the donor to understand the nuances of different communities, the challenges of different communities. So we did take around a 2-year period to understand that. And then when we did unearth or identify certain challenges, like we realized that this organization is doing great, but a little support towards their technology, a little support towards putting in a great platform or an MIS system will help them deliver and scale so much more. And they were finding it really hard to get that support. So we said, okay, we'll probably stop the program funding and fund that what they need. And that was actually an opportunity. Had we ignored that, it would have been an opportunity lost. The program would have stagnated for a period of time, and it would have taken so much longer to grow and to scale. So I think that's the 2 cents of my experience that I'd have to share here.
Thank you so much. I think one reason we are here together also is because we seem to have very many similar views. Just wanted to sum up, for example, from the mid-80s to now, the role of NGOs as seen, and the discourse around NGOs has changed dramatically. In the mid-80s, early 90s, it was still seen as, professionals, new kids on the block, a way to bring voices into the developmental agenda. But today there's a crisis of confidence in NGOs. There is a crisis of accountability. There is a discourse around whether they actually use monies or not. So there are challenges involved in the whole situation, in what we call the donor state NGO, Dostango, that relationship. So I wanted to ask each of you to reflect from your experience on what the challenges you think are that NGOs face. In other words, what are the obstacles to their effectiveness? Could we start with, maybe with you, Gayatri?
I don't know how many of you are NGOs in the room here, but how often do you, in your mind, say, why is this donor telling me to do X when I need to do Y? Right? I'm saying this, I felt it. Hiral used to write grant applications with me, and we've had this conversation. I think there's a presumption that donors go in with that they know all the answers, and the NGOs are there to implement on their vision or their behalf, which I think is fundamentally wrong. The NGOs are the ones on the ground; they know best. So we started doing a bit of work at the A.T. Chandra Foundation to understand what is that gap between what NGOs are asking for and what donors are actually offering them. And when we looked at indirect costs, or your non-programmatic costs, as Hiral said, it has so many names. What we found is that NGOs are not even able to ask to cover all their costs. So then they either subsume it under something else, or your CEO is working without a salary, or they just don't hire certain roles and they all double up to fill it up. And that's causing them to not be as effective as they could be. So we started funding a program or a platform that Bridgespan is anchoring called Pay What It Takes, which is if an NGO is asking for X, they know what it takes, so pay them what it takes. And really, that is what's going to make a difference in terms of the outcomes that they can achieve.
Thank you very much. Nagma, I wanted to ask you, in addition to the challenges that NGOs face, what best practices we have towards, or you have in your experience, towards strengthening them to amplify desired outcomes?
Thank you. So at Edelgive, we are very clear that if a thorough due diligence process has been executed, and we finally are face to face with the organization that has been shortlisted, we're sitting here with the basic, concrete understanding that they know what to do, because they are there, and we know how to fund. And just like in any value chain, different people play different roles. We know how to disperse money, and they know how to do their job. So we, as Edelgave, never go into the programmatic improvement for them. For us, due diligence has happened. They're the experts. They know what to do. What can we do to bridge the gap of capacity? So even in the Grow Fund that we have launched last year, which is a completely organization development fund for 100 NGOs, the premise was never to improve on how to increase student learning outcomes or improve on how to, improving health indicators. It was like every organization, whether for profit or not, needs three basic pillars to stand on, which is a good HR mechanism to retain and encourage talent, financial management to be able to be compliant and manage monies well, and a technology system, however mild or strong, that serves their purpose. And our entire effort is around ensuring they can function better on whatever they choose to function better on. And that's been the most remarkable experience. I think we thought we were fairly decent grant makers, but the exercise of Grow, the exercise of reaching out into the sector, hearing from 400 NGOs from across every state of this country, hearing again and again that what they really need is somebody who will let them pay their electricity bill, someone who can help them hire an extra desk, someone who can get their CO back, someone who can help them buy train tickets to the main capital of the state so that they can just do their donor visit. The whole process of shortlisting became longer for us because the team really froze. It's one thing to hear from the organization sometimes that we are having trouble. It's another thing to hear from a majority of 2,400 saying electricity bill is a conscious problem and therefore we've had to let go of rent. And we're saving rent because we can't pay electricity costs. It's a very humbling exercise. And while we're reading these forms, we are sitting in Edelweiss House in BKC, looking at BKC, sitting in AC, having chai whenever we want. And the team was very affected. And the biggest learning, therefore, before, but now very sure, is listen. And what we are going to hear is not going to be some earth-shattering thing. It's going to be the simple problems. You solve for the simple problems, they'll go and solve the complex one. And that humility has come from somebody just read those proposals, man. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tina, would you care to share your experiences around this and your insights?
Yeah. So I think listening is a very important aspect. I mean, Nagama has beautifully touched upon it. And it's also listening with an open mind. Sometimes you listen, but you're actually waiting for what's the outcome figure, or and that doesn't work. I mean, what we devised we thought that it was important to keep in touch with our projects and our partners on a regular basis. So we actually devised a few mechanisms. One of them was having a monthly call. The other was actually having staff personally visit. So whether the CSR team or the foundation team could visit or not, staff had to visit the project. So there were, you get feedback not just from one direction, but you get feedback from so many different directions and so many different perspectives. The other bit was, if you are waiting for a narrative report or an annual report at the end of the year, then it cannot capture for you nuances that have taken place. So during our regular catch-ups, we always asked what's not working well, or what's bothering you, what can help you more. And I think those are the questions that sort of help bring out the real challenges and help us then address those gradually. So that's been our experience, to actually listen to the partner as well as the people on the ground.
Listening to the partners and listening to the NGOs, and also identifying areas where support is needed around finance, maybe setting up internal functions around finance, around HR, around technology support to do what they do, as well as just financing small operating costs that may not typically be available. Um, we have a similar sort of experience from the 25 years at CAF India too, because we've been working with we ourselves are an NGO, and we have worked with over 3,500 NGOs. And through that experience, many of these organizations we've been working together for over 4 to 5 years. So it isn't just an annual sort of an experience. And it has been quite similar to what you've said in terms of, well, one whole area is around compliances because of the regulatory frameworks, the changes and the rules. That was something that we could actually support with, and also build capacities in our own. So it involves also providing services where they themselves didn't have those, and augmenting what was there. And in terms of project management, of course, and program design is one thing, but how to projectize it and manage it so that it's a little bit more efficient and they can deal with the organization. Yes. I think another.
It's like the
I think
Oscars.
that's a lovely one. And is that a sign? And there's another one, I think, around one is strengthening human resources, but I would wonder what you think about. We found that augmenting human resources has helped too. So we can embed and place people that they would not, and a smaller NGO may not be able to hire themselves, or might share with others. So augmenting human resources. So there's a service element from our side to it as an NGO too. And technical skills, of course, where required. If a new program is to be introduced, if a new cohort has joined the organization around a particular technical skill, and then building alliances is a whole new skill set that we are all learning, and I think we learn together because we want to work together, and we have not really been used to collaborating amongst NGOs too. And the last one, I don't know how you're thinking about, apart from resource mobilization and fundraising, is tracking outcomes. That's a whole area where not only do we need to build our own capacities as CAF India, and I think many of us, but also working with the NGO partners that we have. So I was just wondering if you had any in terms of last words, two big areas you would suggest where support needs to go, financial support. So we have from you, Nagma, already the three: finance, HR, and technology. Would you, Gayatri, like to add?
Sure. So we work with a set of NGOs and just on their non-programmatic needs, and the feedback that we've got from them is is fundraising, and I'm putting fundraising and communications together, and the second is again HR. These have been one. The first one is obviously important to every single NGO, and the second one has just been neglected because of lack of funds.
Yeah, please. I think most of the areas are covered, but technology, what we experienced with our grant partners was that they said we need technology support, but actually we don't even know what the starting point is. So we had our tech team actually brainstorm with them, help them articulate what it is that they needed in technology. So is it an MIS system? Is it something in accounting? So actually we have so much of non-financial resources as well to offer, and it's of great value for a non-profit to just have the opportunity and the space to sit and brainstorm with tech experts that corporates house, and actually break it down that what is the technology that we need. Because several times when they approach a consultant or a tech company, uh, they get sold something that they're not fully actually in need of.
Correct.
So I think that's one of the experiences that we've had, and our tech teams could sort of support certain crucial discussions within nonprofits.
I think I'd like to add one thing apart from just the financial, not just financial support is a very big one. Cannot just say just there, but when we say that, when we're talking to the organizations, they need to collaborate, because I think I'd like to pause here and actually call out that there's a lot of funder communication going from our kind of collective that is very confusing. When we fund in isolation, when we fund basis our objectives, our principles, we're also sending across mixed messages to the entire fraternity of grassroots organizations when we're asking them to collaborate, and we ourselves are giving isolated inputs. And that is something that we need to really introspect. I know the fundamental strength that a conversation has when Gayatri is sitting with us, when an Edelgive and A.T. Chandra are communicating together, when we are sitting and talking about capacity building in the same framework, how there is a reinforcement of the messaging, and how there is a conscious effort to match value to action and demonstrate that, yes, when we talk about collaboration, we are demonstrating collaborative action too. So we can't just, in all of these conversations, I keep coming back to, we need to walk the talk ourselves, and there needs to be a little more conscious action from the funding community on what collaboration, conscious funding, good messaging looks like. When we were doing Grow, your team was one of the first we could go to, because we weren't even confused that there's such an alignment of messaging, and there are some, but we need a larger community to come together.
Can I just add? I'm so glad you brought that up in terms of collaboration and advocating on behalf of the sector. I think one important role that donors need to focus on is really this advocating part, right? One is we only exist because our NGOs exist. Our NGOs only exist because there are problems to be solved. And so if we don't all advocate for each other, it's not going to work. One of the pieces of work that we do is in water, which we're going to be talking about tomorrow in a different forum. But we realize that farmers are suffering because of lack of water. There are NGOs that are willing to work with them, but they don't have the kind of money required to scale. As donors, we can put in money and solve point, I don't even know what percent. But what we could do instead was advocate on behalf of them with the government. So now the government is putting money, all we are doing is project managing. So I think that there's a role that we need to step beyond just making donations, but actually making impact happen.
Thank you so much. Tina, you have some experience and insights on this matter of collaboration between donors.
Yes, I think it needs a lot of patience. Yeah, and we've tried a few collaborations, and few have worked beautifully, and few have failed. And I think it's very important to not be scared to fail, because when something fails, then there is the tension and the pressure of how do I explain this to the board, to different stakeholders. But if you have like an honest narrative to say that the intention was to succeed, and if you're not afraid to fail, then I think that is also a very brave step that many of us need to take more and more as donors and as philanthropists.
Yeah, I think that as we talk about, just the last to sum up, I think as we talk about, as we look at society and a three-sector model, we have what we say in Hindi as Samaj, Sarkar, and Bazaar. If we, in English, we have the government, we have the first sector, the second sector, which is corporates, the private sector, and civil society, of which NGOs are a part. And in such a situation, when we're talking about system change, we are looking at building alliances. And the alliances are not only between donors, it's with governments, it's with bringing people's voices into the narrative, into the discourse. And this is something we too have been experimenting with in terms of creating an ecosystem at CAF India. One of them, which is our flagship just now, is with the government of Jharkhand. We have an embedded team with the Department of Labor, where we are looking at incentivizing the migrants and the labor force to sign up for jobs. And there are over 850,000, 8.5 lakh candidates who've already signed up. And the point is, how do the rest of us, the NGOs in Jharkhand, the donors, the PSUs, all come together, and how do we work together to now meet this need, and also job givers. And it's not a trivial problem. It sounds simple, but I think it really requires us to rethink how we come together. So on that note, I thank all of you and look forward to more questions from the audience and maybe discussion in the group, in the plenary. Thank you very much. Let me get the one. I've got 3 mics to give. Will somebody help us give the mics?
I think they have mics there.
Please?
They have mics.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes more. Would you like us to use it or give more voice to the...
5 minutes for the audience.
Okay, for the audience. Are we on time? We're over? Oh, I'm sorry about that.
No, please, go. It's very important. Take as much time from the agenda as you need.
We are very comfortable here.
People will be here for a long time anyway.
Just relax.
If I promise to make it a very interesting question, would that help?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I'm Pradnya Haldipur. I lead an NGO, a climate organization, and I ask this question on behalf of my program teams. When is it okay? How can I help my program teams understand that it is okay to push back on the funder sometimes? That, ultimately, what we're looking for is a mutually beneficial partnership, and that sometimes we have to trust the funder, but often the funder needs to trust us to know what is done. When is it okay?
It is never going to be okay. Why are you asking for permission? I think pushing back is never okay. Pushing back is done because it's necessary, because it must be done. And sometimes the problem is more in our heads than in actuality. You'd be surprised at the number of funders who actually go back and have that discussion. And it's never a 100% okay. Again, like anything in life, I'd say this actually is a question for everything in life. It's never going to be okay to push back and to say what you want, but you must. And the ones who will say yes are the ones you should have partnered with. And yes, it's very easy for me as a funder to tell you this, and it's very difficult to make those choices, but then there are calculated choices, right? But at least you asked. So if we're waiting for that day where the norms will change and the funder community will say, yes, please push back, that's never coming.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I guess it's all about bargaining power and fallback positions.
I actually have an ask, not a question. There is a hesitancy amongst donors to actually fund. Gayatri was talking about pay what it takes. And one of the biggest asks, usually, which remains unsaid, is you guys also mentioned tracking outcomes and a good technology piece that does help you do that. The ask is that together, there's a collective set of donors sitting here who've been matured, who've been listening to us. Think about how you want to spend a little bit more money or invest a little bit more money on technology solutions that actually do work and not our sellotapes and pins. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're doing that in different pieces. I think one of the things that I'm most excited that we are funding is this concept of a fractal CTO. So for every NGO, it's really hard to hire a CTO. They don't come at NGO rates. So there's an organization that's going to hire them on your behalf, and every NGO gets 1/3 of that person. So you pay, and we donors are putting in some money, so it's even less than 1/3 that you would pay as an NGO. But look it up.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Sumitra from Mobile Crashes, and my question is to the funders sitting up there, but also those in the room. We know the regulatory landscape that we are working in with FCRA changes and a whole load of MCA changes on CSR funding. And we see now the trend moving of historical funding organizations getting into direct implementation because everybody has something to do right now. My question to all of you here is that in this space where implementation and last mile connectivity is going to increase, and it must increase, the problems are large, but also the competitiveness is going to increase. Many large organizations are also getting into grassroots implementation. And the regulatory landscape is limiting the collaboration and the spirit of collaboration that we are talking about, the NGO to NGO collaboration, the subgranting, all of that. In this ecosystem, what are some of the more, I would say, indigenous funders, the Indian philanthropic foundations, thinking about protecting the collaborative spirit really? It's great to talk, but the regulation really is not allowing much of collaboration. And second part to the same question is that when the implementation landscape is going to get very complicated and messed up in the next 10 years, how do these small organizations that you are referring to, how are you going to stand by them and protect them? What are your plans?
But, yeah, Tina?
Yeah, I can probably try and attempt answering that. So I think for us consciously, we are looking at a criteria to start with our funding. So we want to begin to fund more smaller organizations and not organizations that have huge revenues, etc. So on our part, we are making small changes and taking small steps towards helping smaller nonprofits survive and collaborate. I do very much am in agreement that the scenario is getting complicated and it's becoming really competitive. But I think the key over there is to keep communicating and keep finding a pathway in between where we can still continue to collaborate. So we have a few examples where organizations sort of come together on a project and just say that we can't probably both of us put our name to this, but we'll look at part A and you look at part B. So I'm sure like as complicated as it gets, there's still going to be way and space for us to make collaborations work. It's just, I guess, how strongly we're going to work hard to make them work. Yeah. So I guess we are committed to do that.
Yeah. I'll just give a very quick answer, just in the interest of time. We've actually found collaborators work really well. We work with really grassroots NGOs in places where I could not have found on a map prior to working there. And so, for example, in Madhya Pradesh, we're working on natural farming with a consortium of 23 NGOs. Each one has on their own carved out where they want to work, and we fund it. We don't get into who does what, they take care of that. So I think collaboratives do work, and these are NGOs that don't have FCRA. These are NGOs that don't get any CSR funding because they're in Panna and Chhatarpur and places like that. So they work, and we continue to support them.
And for us, to summarize, it is collaboratives as a structure of giving, get many funders to come together to give many kinds of fund organizations, focused very clearly on the small and mid-sized organizations in the diverse part of India. Even in the sourcing of these applications, we went in 20 regional languages because the fact that Indian grassroots organizations don't operate out of English is a reality. So just the intent doesn't matter. The designing of how we look out for organizations, how we fund, has to have that as a conscious choice. So as an Indian foundation that also has goodwill across the world in many places, it becomes our responsibility really to craft those processes where many can come together and fund to many. And we are dealing with 3 kinds of regulations very actively. Like I said, all of us here on this forum are actually doing whatever we can in our capacity to ensure we hedge for the multiple kinds of risks and the opportunities that come our way. So there is conscious designing around it.
Well, thank you. I think we are We are running out of time, so we could meet over tea. I just wanted to thank all of you, the three of you here particularly. And I think the worries we have here is because best practices are here in front of us, but it's not very widespread. It's a challenge now for us to spread this word and for us to draw on your experiences and to support unrestricted and institutional funding so that organizations can grow and work to spread, to kind of accelerate progress towards the 2030 agenda while strengthening themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.